So when you present TBLT, it's kind of, you said the word radical before, right? It's kind of radical in the sense that, but if I don't teach the grammar, they're not going to learn it. Well, no, actually they are going to learn it, right? Okay, I'll let you know where you can put the grammar. The grammar is okay, can come, but not started with the grammar. That is a PPP, right? Presentation, practice, production. That's not what we are doing. A lot of research that says that that's not the best method to learn languages. So teachers everywhere react to it. Even when you train them in how to do TBLT, I had pleasure to go and visit them afterwards. And I'm like, that's not TBLT what you are doing, but you're just learning and you did a great final project. Still not TBLT. Why? Because, we think we know how to do something, and to do something different is scary. Yeah. This is as scary as getting in a car that does have no driver, right? Doesn't matter how how much we read about how safe they are or this and that. People don't want to do it. Why? Because they're more comfortable with the known. Yes, there is a lot more possibilities for autonomous learning. And, it grows so fast and it's getting so good that why not? You know what I mean? Yes, of course. There are so many changes, but we can say, well, if you do this and this and this while you're interacting with machine, this is beneficial for you.
Welcome to the Language Innovators podcast. My name is Dr. Phung, the CEO and co-founder of Eduling, the hub for task-based teaching and learning. The Eduling app and platform offers self-paced and teacher-led courses using games and tasks that students can complete individually with the AI or in pairs. With me today is Professor Marta González-Lloret for an episode on technology-mediated task-based language teaching. Marta is Professor of Spanish and Applied Linguistics at the University of Hawaii, where she has taught for over 30 years. She is ranked among the world's top 2% most cited researchers and among the top 400 linguists worldwide in Stanford University's 2023 ranking. In 2018, she received the University of Hawai Board of Regents Medal for Excellence in Teaching. Her research focuses on technology-mediated task-based language teaching and learning, L2 pragmatics, and foreign language teacher education. Her work has appeared in leading journals. She is currently one of the editors of John Benjamin's book series, Task-Based Language Teaching, Issues, Research, and Practice, and editor of the NFLRC Pragmatics and Language Learning book series. Welcome, Marta, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So first thing first, can you share with us maybe a little bit more about you and what you are currently working on?
So I think you introduced me already enough. I'm a professor at the University of Hawaii, and I've been here for a little bit over 30 years. My world has always been applied linguistics. I am part of the Spanish department also, so I teach courses for Spanish learners, and I do quite a lot of teacher training, not just for Spanish, but for the other languages. And I'm now department chair, so my research agenda is a little bit thinner since my administrative work is a little bit heavier. But I am working in 3 projects that have to do with how different emotions, mostly self-confidence and anxiety, actually affect how students learn languages when they're also mediated by technology, so in virtual environments mostly. And of course, I've always worked with tasks, so they're also task mediated. And like everybody else in the field, I'm also exploring, AI uses for language learning. And I recently worked as knows in looking with 2 of my students at a bot and see how that bot promoted the acquisition of vocabulary and also morphology.
At the end of this conversation or later on in this conversation, we'll ask about your take on AI chatbot. My dissertation was on task engagement with Professor Rod Ellis. However, in my experience implementing tasks, there's still a lot of questions. So I want to ask some really basic questions about why do we use task-based language teaching in language education? And could you compare and contrast this approach with other approaches that we have been talking about, like content-based instruction or project-based learning, or even the traditional approach of present, practice, produce?
Okay, so I have to say that we hear a lot about task-based language teaching, but if we compare it to other methodologies that have existed for years and years and years, we are still quite innovative. So in the sense that we know their principles, we've been studying the principles, so we have now the theory of how it works, but implementation is always slow. If you think in communicative language teaching, right now it's pretty much the entire world knows about it, practices in one way or another, but it took a long time. I mean, some countries are still not even implementing good communicative language teaching. So I think, when we talk about TBLT and how it works and how to implement it, we have to think that it is still quite new in its implementation. So that to start. And in comparison with other methodologies, I think many of them, so content-based language learning, or in Europe, they call it CLIL, right? Content and language integrated learning, project-based language learning, they're all based in experiential learning and learning by doing. So it's task-based language teaching. And what's different is that they all build on communicative language. So by now, I think pretty much 99% of the practitioners know that you need to talk in order to learn to talk. It's like playing tennis. You can't play tennis by watching Wimbledon only, right?
Right.
So it is a skill. You need to practice it. But these methods go a little bit beyond. And some of them say, well, because we're engaging in doing something, why don't we also learn what we are doing, right? So you have content-based, say, why won't we learn some content through it? Or you have project-based and say, well, why don't we actually develop some of the cognitive skills that high schoolers need while they are engaged in the language learning? So I think they all pushed the communicative language teaching a step further into learning by doing and experiential learning. And task-based language teaching is like, yeah, we'll do an experiential learning, but we are about language. So we're not going to go into content or cognitive development or group work dynamics. We're just going to stay with the language.
Thank you for that distinction with a focus on language and performing communicative tasks, right? Using language to communicate and do real life tasks using language. And I can see some difference there. I'm asking also because now I'm involved in language education in Vietnam. And the government has made a policy to try to make English the second language in schools by 2045. So there's a lot of conversation about content-based instruction. But my worry sometimes is that if we do content-based instruction with heavy reading, then the way of teaching language may slide back into like teaching vocabulary in order to understand the reading text rather than truly communicative. We talk a lot about implicit and explicit learning, and I think when you mention task-based language teaching, in my mind, I don't even just use the word innovative. To me, sometimes it's even radical, because when we say we teach language, but we don't start with the language, right? We start with a task and engaging learners in experiencing the language. So I want to go back and ask about explicit and implicit learning here. And what do you think about the role of implicit and explicit learning in second language acquisition?
Well, we have 30 years of studies, looking at implicit and explicit. So we have quite a robust knowledge of how it works, right? We know that some things can be learned implicitly. Some things are much more difficult to be learned implicitly. We have research on child language acquisition, right? Most children learn the language implicitly with some feedback, of course, right? But they're not given a manual when they're born to learn the language. It's done implicitly. So as adults, we know there's some ways of learning it implicitly. We also know that some forms that are they're non-salient, that they're structurally very different from our L1s. Those may need some explicit teaching. Some in the field of pragmatics, for example, which is my other field, there's quite a lot of studies. Most of them come to the conclusion that a little bit of explicit learning is actually necessary for pragmatics, because a lot of pragmatic moves are opaque. You don't see them. There are things that happen in society, and they're not as clear as, oh, that verb was wrong, right? So it requires a little bit of explicit teaching. So I think there's a space for both of them. But, again, if you believe that people use the language for communication the same as kids do, well, there is a little bit of a base for learning most of it implicit, and then whatever cannot be learned implicitly, then we can supplement it with explicit teaching or with good focus on form that explicitly teach what is needed.
You're talking about pragmatics, and that makes me remember the time that I came to the US. And of course, my language was still developing. And I still remember my advisor giving me advice on the two types of sentence structures that I can use to make requests, like the two-part request. Would you mind if? And I was wondering if, because it would be so much more polite. And I remember that until now, because sometimes I also tell students that we need to make some hidden rules of communication explicit to them so that they know the appropriateness of communication here. So you are interested in technology-mediated language teaching. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how different or similar it is to just say general task-based language teaching?
I think it's, the main principles of task-based language teaching apply to technology. So the base is still TBLT. We're going to say TBLT, it's a lot shorter. But a long time ago on my dissertation, I was interested in technology already. I somehow saw that, there was going to be a big jump in the future on how much technology we use, what we use it for. So I thought, well, these principles are great, but what happens when all of these all of these tasks that we do have an external component, have one more component, which is the technology? And that's how I started looking at technology. But the principles have always been TBLT principles. So the technology is just there. Of course, the technology itself modifies the way the task is carried out. It actually modifies the task in itself. But the principles of how we learn the language, the learning by doing, it's the same with or without technology.
Can you elaborate a little on how tasks change specifically in the context of technology?
Yes. So as an example, when we gave directions, that's a very common task that people have been doing for a long time. We will have a book with a map, and people would be in some place and they will hear something, they will have to map it, right? That's a very common task. But who does that anymore? Who has maps anymore, right? So no one really goes around with a big paper map. Now everybody goes with a phone, which means the where are you part is not necessary. It has modified the task itself. The way we ask, we don't ask where to go to a place because we know most of the time, right? I mean, we could have no internet. I mean, we need to. But in a way, finding your way in a city, that task has been modified. Now we may be asking other things like, what's the best bakery in this neighborhood? Or, how can I get here to a safe neighborhood, right? I see in a map. how to get there, but which streets are safer than others, right? So that modify, finding your way around a city, has been modified by the technology.
That's more like the technology, like the world has changed, right?
Yes.
And
so the tasks of the world
have to change. Yes.
Yeah, or I remember your research also has to do with doing tasks, say on communication platforms, right? So do you have other examples in terms of completing tasks through Zoom like this, or through WeChat, or any other platforms that you have investigated?
Yes, pretty much every time you involve technology into doing a task, the task has to be modified a little bit because you have that third component, that third space, right, which is the technology. So I do a lot of work on virtual exchanges, so two institutions working together, and that task didn't even exist before we had these Zoom meetings, right? You had pen pals, but you had to wait a month between a letter going one place and another. Now you can do a lot of tasks that are visual, that are audible, and you can do it, instantaneously through Zoom. So the technology itself has created possibilities for tasks themselves. It has modified writing, for example. We can go into AI and writing and language learning, and that's a huge topic right now too. But even something as simple as writing a review for a restaurant, right? That's a task that we do now because apps like Yelp or Google Reviews exist, right? But before, we would just tell our friends about it. This restaurant is great, but we wouldn't actually write a review unless that was your job. Most people will not write a review, no? But now that's a task that we do in our L1. I go to a restaurant, I like it, I write a little review, take a few pictures, and those are very, very interesting tasks that you can incorporate in the L2, and that are authentic, that are hands-on, that you're learning the language by doing, by writing, by reading, and that didn't exist.
If we are on a communication platform, and these days these platforms are multimodal and also have allowed you access, say, to translation, to read aloud feature, and even AI features these days. So I'm sure that I feel like the way we communicate and the way we focus on form may be different. Do you have any comments or experience on that aspect?
Yes, the students, the learners, and the teachers, but the learners have a lot of access to different tools that modify the way they learn autonomously too. So, in these types of platforms, the negotiation may be a little bit different because the students may not have to ask, oh, how do you say this or how do you say that? They just, go open a window and look for it. And so the negotiation is different. We know that negotiation is important for learning. So I think we still need to investigate how the technology is actually affecting that type of learning. And there's not actually none that I know of that is looking exactly at that. So the things that don't get negotiated, do they actually, are they learned also, right? Because they're exchanging a different way. So that affects the way that communication works and learning through communication works. We need a lot more research on that. So, all those PhD students out there, lots of things to do.
Yes, and that's my next question. Actually, I read your article about suggestions on doing technology-mediated task-based language teaching research. And I remember reading about the concept of task complexity, right? That may also be a little bit different on the technological platform. And of course, that article, I think, was published a few years ago. And now with AI, do you have any suggestions in terms of research questions, research topics that you would like to see being investigated?
There is so much because technology is going so fast. So I think, like I was saying at the beginning, most of the principles of TBLT and how it works are now in place. So we can look at, how some of these technologies fit within those principles, whether they enhance what we know that works for learning or whether it impedes it, right? And how do those marriage, right? AI grows so fast also that, we say now, oh, you can't do these with AI. And then, OpenAI launches the next ChatGPT and, oh, now it can be done, right? So all you can do is try to apply the principles. That's why I always say, from working in technology, when I started working, the technology was not what it is today, right? But tasks are first. So you have to think of the task. The task is what promotes the language learning. Now, if that task is mediated by the technology, we bring it in. If it can be amplified, it can be supported, then we bring it in. If it doesn't, then we don't use it, right? Not that we have to use technology for everything. I mean, we still have conversations with friends, and we need to be able to do that, hopefully for a long time, right? So we still need to teach students how to do small talk, how to interact with people face to face. So not everything is about technology. We still go to shops and buy, maybe less, but we still do it, right? So those tasks are first. So your question about possible topics, there are so many. I mean, anything to do with AI is still not explored. So many.
Yeah.
Do you think that AI in particular, and when I say that I mean like large language models, represent any kind of a sort of a step change in like what's possible with technology? Because I mean, if you look at the sort of history of language learning applications, I mean, it's rife with the explicit forms of learning, right? Like, Duolingo was started in like 2012, and you could do speech recognition and speech synthesis at those times. So you had spoken language technologies, but the negotiation of meaning and interaction with concepts and like the conversational agents were still like very primitive at that time. And now you have something that can kind of at least mimic, certain portions of the conversational aspects of TBLT. Do you think that is it? Would you agree with that assertion, or do you think that?
Totally. I mean, now I think there are a lot more tools for independent learning. So anybody that wants to learn a language, can, like you say, at least mimic a conversation, right? May not be very pragmatically accurate, maybe still have a lot of bias, but I mean, it's so much better than nothing, right? So yes, there's a lot more possibilities for autonomous learning. And, it grows so fast and it's getting so good that why not? You know what I mean? Yes, of course. There are so many changes that we can really predict, but we can say, well, if you do this and this and this while you're interacting with machine, this is beneficial for you, right? So if you just talk and don't receive any feedback, for example, well, you don't know if you're talking, if what you're saying is actually correct or not. You're, not, to me, there's 4 pillars to learning a language: input, output, interaction, and feedback, right? So feedback is essential. When you talk to a person, if you say something incorrect, the person is probably going to make a face, or, you can tell that something is not right there, right? That negotiation, then that interaction happens. And then that's how you set your parameters, how you actually learn that piece of language, right? That still doesn't happen. If you do something that is really incorrect, maybe AI will say, oh, can you do that? But most of the time is going to assume what you're trying to say, right? Unless you also, you can prompt it to give you feedback. But again, you have to have all of those things in order to mimic something that is natural. It can be done. And of course, why not? Again, if you do not have any access to another ways of learning the language, by all means, that is better than nothing.
Yeah. I think we have to tell you our exciting update with Eduling, because we just launched our updated Eduling AI. Basically, it's a chatbot that does the things that we want to see. And for me, I completely agree with you with the four things that I often cite myself: input, output, interaction, and feedback. And so negotiation of meaning, focus on form. And when we started designing the AI chatbot interactions, that's what we also think about. First, we need interesting tasks for students to do. So to us, it's, I often say, two sides of the equation: interesting tasks to complete first, and then fine-tuning the interaction with the AI. So we need the two things. And I'm happy to share that our chatbot can negotiate meaning. It doesn't just assume and make guesses all the time. We also fine-tune it so that it can provide recasts, right? One-time corrective feedback. It can also prompt learners to say something based on the previous utterance. And it can also provide some explicit corrections sometimes. So we would love for you to try it later on and see what your take on it is. But Nick, do you want to
shameless
share
plug.
anything? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking because comment here about like interaction, or input, output, interaction, and feedback. I think this is a really great way to summarize some of it, because if you think about like the mapping onto technologies that have existed, right? So for spoken language, right? On the input side, we've had, you know, the ability to play audio or synthesize speech for a while. Those systems, they get better all the time, but like, I mean, speech synthesis and speech recognition have been about at the same level for maybe a decade or so. Like they're not substantially better today, not even with AI, right? Like the speech input and output is still going through a TTS system that is based on decade-old technology. But for input, you have that. And then for output, you know, you have speech recognizers. So there's like two pillars of it. If you can, you know, tolerate this mapping of like these things onto technology, then interaction is sort of the dialogue system, right? At least prior to large language models, like dialogue systems were the scaffolding for trying to make computer-based dialogues, right? But the LLM era has made interaction a lot better. And the last missing pillar is feedback, right? So the models, I mean, because of just the way that they're trained and a lot of the, you know, you mentioned like biases that are in them, you know, they have some very like well-known tendencies to, you know, glaze you or just constantly agree or not really, even if you just like babble nonsense at them, they'll just kind of say, haha, that's a great point, and then move on with whatever they were saying, which is sort of like, it's very non-human type of characteristic. But the feedback, like the ability to actually like stop and say, no, I don't understand what you said, right? Which is something that humans are just naturally doing. So yeah, the fourth pillar, I think, is kind of what's been missing. But like, you know, this is something that like we are working on actively, and apparently you are as well, and a lot of people around the world are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good way to map it. Don't forget also that, you know, input is also written. So we had access to tons of written input, right, since the era of internet, and that is kind of covered there. But and you know, it's the one that is more solid. But yeah, the output, the interaction, and the feedback are progressing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, the
so
input
fast.
could be a bunch of different forms, of course.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So talking about AI chatbots, and we are talking about some benefits, do you see some kind of limitations and challenges in your work? So you're talking about pragmatic competence, for example. Do you feel like the AI can be pragmatically competent or appropriate in interactions with the learners so that it gives good models?
There's not a ton of research, again, because it's so new, and you know, we know how long it takes to publish research, do the research and then get it published. So but there is, I would say, a boom now of studies on AI and pragmatics too. And so far what we know is that it's really good. Most of the studies, I have to say, are either 3.5 or 4.0 for ChatGPT mostly, but it is not very good at some things and is really good at others. So it's really good at academic speech and formal language, for example, but it is not very good at informal language. It is not very good at dialectal variations in pragmatics also, you know, the different ways Of course, there's no embodiment, right? So no gaze, no hugs, no kisses, no things like that, right? That happens in greetings, for example. It talks a lot, talks too much, so it breaks a lot of Russian maxims, actually. And for L2, there's only a bunch of studies. There's actually a book coming out from Naoko Taguchi on AI and pragmatics learning, which I think is excellent. It has really good studies in it. And those have looked at different parts of the language. So sometimes it's a speech acts, but sometimes is, how it's able to change registers, for example. It's not very good yet. So for pragmatics, I think it lags behind everything else, which is normal, because actually the research on pragmatics kind of always goes, one step behind everything else in second language acquisition, probably because there's less people working on it too.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But it is really good at some things. So it can mimic, like Nicholas was saying, it can mimic human interaction, basic interaction quite well.
Yeah.
And for some speech acts is really good. So it's really good at requests. So you ask for something, it will give it to you, right? Because it's always trying to please you also. But you really have to prompt it if you want that request to be denied, for example, right? Which is what we do all the time. If you ask me to borrow my car, I may have to deny it today because it's raining, right? So ChatGPT doesn't do that very well.
Right.
So
yeah,
still quite behind in that sense.
Yeah.
When ChatGPT first came out, it was this fine-tuned version of GPT-3, right? Which was a model that you could use directly with the API without actually having they do all this, they call it reinforcement learning with human feedback, where essentially for like a pile of different prompts, they have a large army of people that are, deployed in questionable circumstances in a lot of cases around the world to like fine tune and say like, no, say this, don't say this, don't, right? So there's this whole pile of editing that's gone into the persona that people, I mean, it's not personified, but like the persona that they have, which in a lot of cases sort of takes the form of a sort of an obsequious kind of secretary type in a lot of cases, which, it's problematic. But the original, just like the raw pre-trained LLM, which again, they're very hard to get access to now, unless you use like open source versions. But those were just the raw sort of probability statistics of like, if you say this, this is the thing that follows. And I'm wondering if you did any comparisons between like how a sort of the pre-trained model before it gets kind of munged into the consumer product, how it did on any of these types of tasks. Was it better or worse, or?
That's a very good question. No, I have not looked at that. There's a scholar in Belgium, Serge Bibot, and he's been working on dialogue systems since for the pandemic, actually. So I would say, he's a good person to follow in that kind of research if you're interested more in the evolution of dialogue systems and how, and that he works with tasks too, how these affect the tasks. But I personally haven't done that.
If we all talk like the AI, then it will be, like you say, a lot of glazing and complimenting and agreeing. From our experience as well, if we have an open-ended conversation with the AI, it's kind of boring. And that's why one of the reasons why we also wanted to do task-based, because giving the learner something interesting to do, a task to do with an outcome to achieve, rather than just having this like endless open-ended conversations with the AI. You also work with teachers, right? So in teacher education, what do you feel teachers' receptiveness to task-based language teaching or the implementation of task-based language teaching in different contexts?
I have actually done some workshops like pretty much all over the world. And to me, it's always fascinating how the the reception of TBLT is so similar everywhere that you do this. We have to think that most language teachers have been language learners themselves. And it's really difficult to stay away from what you know. We know it by students too, right? When we present with a method that is innovative, they're like, oh, but can I just get, fill up the blanks forms? They're so good. It's like, no, they're not good. They're easy or they're comfortable, but they're not good, So people are comfortable with what they know. And this is the case for teachers too. So when you present TBLT, it's kind of, you said the word radical before, right? It's kind of radical in the sense that, but if I don't teach the grammar, they're not going to learn it. Well, no, actually they are going to learn it, right? It's okay. I'll let you know where you can put the grammar. The grammar is okay, can come, but not started with the grammar. That is a PPP, right? Presentation, practice, production. That's not what we are doing. There are a lot of research that says that that's not the best method to learn languages. So teachers everywhere react to it. Even when you train them in how to do TBLT, I had the pleasure to go and visit them afterwards. And I'm like, that's not TBLT what you're doing, but you're just learning and you did a great final project. Still not TBLT. Why? Because, we think we know how to do something, and to do something different is scary. I mean, it's as scary as getting in a car that does have no driver, right? Doesn't matter how how much we read about how safe they are or this and that. People don't want to do it. Why? Because they're more comfortable with the known, what they know that works, right? I think to me, what really has made it different is explaining to teachers, sometimes giving them the research to read about it, that our brains, in order to learn a piece of grammar, a piece of language, which it is necessary, and we talked at the beginning, it may need to be explicit, your brain must have the necessity for it. So if I come on Monday and say, we're going to talk about past tense, this is how you conjugate past tense, blah, blah, blah. It comes through here, it comes out through there. Why? Because there's no need for me to know that, right? And that's what research in psychology tells us. We do need to have some cognitive need for something to actually absorb it. So starting with a task gives the students that cognitive need. It's like, oh, I can't say these. Okay, now here is how you do it. Here is how you say it. Oh, good, I need it, right? So our brains will then hopefully retain it a lot more than if we just come and give an explanation that there's no reason. And to me, that kind of resonates with teachers, because teachers understand that. It's like, but we've seen that 5 times. Yes, you explained it 5 times. Doesn't mean that they learned it, right? Why? Because there was no need for it. So to me, that works a little bit. And also giving them the places where, that grammar chunk that they're dying to explain comes, right? Telling them, well, this is where you can put the focus on form. We know if we prepare tasks in a way that, they're not totally unfocused, but that something is going to come up, right? If you have to, write about your childhood, that's going to require certain verb tenses, right? You just know it's going to happen. You don't have to tell them right in the past tense. No, I mean, it's going to happen naturally when they're starting to make these issues, or when they're talking and you go and listen. It's like, oh, this couple is wrong. This couple is wrong. You can stop the class and say, okay, listen, remember that, in order to do the past tense, we need to use these and we need to use these. 5-minute little snippet of that grammar point. Now, let's go back and try again, right? Then there is a need for it. Most likely they're going to be talking and looking at that blackboard where you have the things written, or their book, or their paper, or their book. And I guarantee they're going to learn it a lot better.
Is that what you would consider pop-up grammar?
I would call it focus on form, which is what TBLT calls it.
Okay.
You have to be careful between focus on forms, which is with an S, and that means
Confusing.
really explaining the grammar,
Mhm.
or
Okay.
focus on form, which is like
Mhm.
little snippets
Incidental.
that can happen depending on
Mhm.
your TBLT framework. It may happen at the end, like Ellis, right? Or even at the beginning and at the end. Or if you're following long, then every time that it happens, wherever in any pedagogic task, you can just put it there.
Mhm.
The need for a specific form, or like it should arise naturally as part of their like need to communicate. Like if you're unable to express something that maybe how to say in your L1, it's like, I know I need this word, but I don't have it. And then that's when form-focused instruction is most effective. Or, I mean, does it still have the same problems of flying out the window, or is it
No,
just
that's
like people are
exactly
primed to be
when it
receptive at that
happens.
point? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
When you have a cognitive
Okay.
necessity for it, that's
Right.
when your brain is more ready to absorb it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can give this example. I was trying a task with our Eduling AI, and I have to describe differences between two pictures. And it can be useful for pronunciation as well, because when you describe differences, you have to use contrastive stress, right? Naturally, perhaps you need to use it. And in one picture, there's this shovel with 4 lines. I use the word lines. And then on the other picture, there are 5 lines. And then I asked the AI, okay, should I use the word lines or grooves? So then it says grooves is a good word, or indentations is a good word. So I realized that I myself learned some more specific or precise way of describing this shovel, because usually I would not have to do it anyway. So I guess it's a good example of focus on form in a way from the AI. And now I remember, and I think that I can use those words again. But I was just going to comment that thank you for the suggestion in terms of reminding the teacher about when our brain is ready to receive the information or sees the necessity in receiving the information, because I am trying to communicate some ideas about task-based language teaching as well. And just this morning, I was reflecting on what Rod Ellis said, and he said something about explicit knowledge or explicit learning as well. And he says, explicit knowledge does not exist in a vacuum. And my interpretation is that we need experience to hook our consciousness on, right? If we don't even have an experience of something, we cannot understand the explicit knowledge. We need the implicit knowledge to place our explicit in that reservoir. Going back to the resistance, I think the first thing is you mentioned the way they learned a language, because our intuition is that we need to teach about the language. But another influence is the drilling. I feel like the audiolingual method is so influential that sometimes teacher also likes the idea of drilling with the illusion that drilling will lead to learning. And I see that in the students that I teach as well. The students started with a really strong idea of a communicative lesson, but it ended up being a lesson full of boring drilling. Implementation is very difficult, for sure. We have so many wrong intuitions about learning and how our brain learns.
And it doesn't help that, like we were saying at the beginning, this is still an innovative method, right? What it doesn't help is that, teachers are also very dependent on a book. And there's really not a lot of good materials. There are some. We actually use one in our program, but there's not a lot of good textbooks that are task-based that can be used like, a book that the teacher goes on today's page, tomorrow's page, right? Because they're very dependent, also contextually dependent, especially if you do long types of TBLT, right? If you have to start with a needs analysis and see what tasks are going to be essential for your students. What do they need to learn to do when they leave your classroom? And a book is really difficult for that, because a commercial book is based on homogeneity and selling the same book to millions of people. That's how you make money. But TBLT is not about that. So not having that tool to depend on really, really strongly is also another difficulty for some teachers, especially in some parts of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And so my question, the next question, and I mentioned the word bottlenecks because I heard a recent presentation from a professor at Columbia University Teachers College, and she listed some bottlenecks in implementing task-based language teaching. And I will read the list here, and I would love to hear your take on all of these. She listed lack of input-based tasks because also there's this kind of misconception that task-based language teaching has to be communicative. It is communicative, but it doesn't have to be output-based all the time or production-based. Also, lack of systematic tasks. Perhaps it has to do with the materials or the textbooks that you just mentioned. Lack of alignment of communicative and linguistic goals. I guess here what she meant is that usually when we plan a task, we plan communicative goals. We don't really plan language, but you mentioned language-focused tasks, so maybe we can talk about that. Lack of longer-term planning. Maybe teachers can have one or two tasks, but what about the whole course with just tasks, right? Lack of scaling in terms of how we can scale this approach. And you say that this is relatively new or innovative still. A lack of TBLT materials in coursebooks. So you mentioned that. And also systematic implementation of task-based language teaching due to contextual factors. I think there are a lot of challenges in many contexts that make it difficult to implement. And also task-based language teaching for beginners.
I think to me, some of these reflect the lack of understanding of TBLT. So I do not agree with about half of them, maybe with half, but the other half I don't. So a lack of input-based tasks, that to me just means that person does not understand what TBLT is because you design the tasks, right? So you can have input, as many input-based tasks as you want. And again, input is reading, is listening. So don't tell me you don't have enough videos on internet. Don't tell me you don't have enough text that you can read. Don't tell me that you don't have, audios. I mean, there's billions of things that you can use for input-based tasks. You just have to develop them, right? And by develop them, I don't mean something really difficult. It's like what teachers do all the time, right? I found a really good audio and I bring it to the class as an example of something that then we are going to do, an input-based task. I prepare a video with a little group of possible words that appear, possible words that don't. Imagine a person shopping in a grocery shop, right? And then I have a list of words and the students have to listen, mark the ones that are groceries, the ones that are not, right? Choose, and then they start seeing, they're starting to have input about the word, they're seeing the words written, they're listening to the words. I can play that video many times. There's tons of things that you can do. So either slack there is because the teacher is not implementing it correctly, right? It's not task-based language teaching doesn't mean that you come to the class and you do the target task in class, the final task. You need that as scaffolding. So I personally subscribe more to the Long's method. So for me, all tasks start with, so there's a target task, and from that target task, you develop your pedagogic tasks that you're gonna bring to the class. So the first group of pedagogic tasks are always input-based. Then you just do those. Then you move to guided output. So students start working together, maybe in pairs, doing something, rearranging dialogues, looking at things that fit, don't fit, could be find the differences. And then you move to more free output. And then there can be role plays, or there can be interactions online, virtually with other students. It can be many things so that they can at the end do the final target task. Focus on form can be given and should be given at all times during that line of pedagogic tasks. So the whole first group is input-based tasks. So to me, that is not a valid or something. And again, lack of systematic tasks, that has to do with your development of the tasks. So in my program, I have very systematic input-based, guided output, theory output tasks, and those get reproduced through different lessons, that model. And students know that you start with these, then you do a little bit of speaking, then you do more speaking, and then you are able to do the target task at the end. So it's very systematic. And alignment with communicative and linguistic goals. That's what TBLT is about. Is, what do I need to do in a target task at the end? I need to be able to write an essay to go into a college, right? That is your communicative, your goal, right? And that task dictates what kind of language needs to come in that letter. Then in the input base, we may read some letters that are good letters, underline, maybe present a letter that is not so good and find out why it's not good after we've seen a good one. Maybe discuss with a partner, what is the difference between this good letter and not letter, right? And then a more guided output, they can write in pairs a good letter, then the target task would be a final letter, right? So that has a very clear communicative goal and a linguistic goal, right? What is a good letter and not good letter is dictated by the task. Lack of longer term planning, I think this is a institutional issue, right? This is the same for anything. And we said it's innovative, so it's hard to put something in place and then people that come afterwards may not like it and they just change it, right? That's not a problem of the method. That's an institutional problem.
Yeah.
That is, there's some places that still are doing grammar translation because they think communicative is not going to work. That, again, is not a problem of CLT. We know that it works. It's a problem of the institution. Lack of scaling. I'm not sure if this means that you can just do it in a class, but not in a
I think in terms of
program.
making it more common and widespread. And I think I agree that mostly it's an implementation issue, but from the understanding what task-based language teaching is, why we should use it, right? My first question is why, because sometimes teachers still need to be convinced of why. And we discussed some misconceptions and wrong intuitions about learning. And also a lot of other contextual factors and maybe the exam system. I'm just talking out loud. Actually, I was invited to write a book chapter about TBLT in Vietnam. I think it's part of the book series that you are one of the editors of. So I'm looking forward to looking into it more. But a lot of challenges, not with the method itself, I agree. And that's why, I'm very passionate about sharing about task-based language teaching, but about how to make it embraced by teachers and teachers know how to write tasks, how to develop tasks, how to implement them in the classroom.
Yeah, and even when teachers know how to do it and they do it really great, when they go out, they have that institutional pressure, right? Like you said, sometimes your students have to perform in a certain exam or test, right? And then they feel that they have to go back to teaching grammar, right? There's a book in the TBLT series by Erlam and Tolosa, and they looked at teachers in the New Zealand context, and they saw at their training program, and then they followed them to different schools, and so how they implemented it and what happened. And you can see there the differences that institutional support does for a teacher, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that definitely happens. But I think, again, because it's something innovative, it's something different, you always have to try to convince people, why is this good, right? Why do we know that it works? And I published something a long time ago, I think 2015, we compared a big program that was grammar-based, and then we changed it to be TBLT-based, and then we test them at the end and compare, but we also test them in grammar. So we test their ability to talk, to write, to speak, and grammar. And actually, the group that had done TBLT was as good in grammar as the one that had done grammar-based. Grammar-based was not better, but they were a lot better in speaking than the grammar one. So they do learn the grammar. That's what most teachers don't see, is that they think they're not going to learn this grammar for this test.
Mm-hmm.
So they are going to learn the grammar for the test, and they're also able to speak.
Right.
So, but of course, it takes convincing again, because it's something radical, different, innovative, and it takes some convincing to do.
So this is like really good for, I mean, just at least my understanding, because we've been talking a lot about this systematic approach, right? Because if you take a needs assessment and you have a target task in mind, and then working backwards to the simpler things that have to lead up to it, are there any resources or guides on like how to do, like, is there anything out there that you would recommend for like how to do that, or is it more of an art?
I have a little book that explains exactly how to do it. I don't want to do, publicity here.
No,
it's
you can.
A little book for teachers.
You can do
we
that.
want to share knowledge.
Sounds like a great book.
Yeah.
I would like to read this.
It's something I created exactly because of this, because when I go to give workshops or to train teachers, they, really have a little bit of difficulty. So this goes step by step, how to create the task, how to sequence them so that they make sense. We haven't talked about complexity, but, how do you you have all these tasks, but now how do you present them to students? So starting with input, guided output, and free output is a way to controlling for the complexity of the task, but also within those, you can change the parameters of the task itself to make it more complex. Or that same task, writing a Yelp review, for example, can be done by a very beginner student, by just giving the stars and writing a line and posting a photo. And it can be done by advanced student, where they write a really good review of the food, the atmosphere, everything else. So it's the same task, but you can simplify it or complexify it by tweaking the number of elements, how, the language that is used, etc. So there is ways to do it. And in general, I think, when I train teachers, they see it and they're able to create really good tasks. Teachers are imaginative. And, to me, I always say there's nothing better than an imaginative teacher, because you can have a book, but the book is never going to be perfect. If you have a good imagination, you can take that tool and convert it into gold. Yeah. If not, even if the tool is good, it's just going to be that tool.
Yeah.
What's the name of the book?
My book?
Yes.
It's a guide for technology-mediated language learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will look at that.
I think you can find it pretty much, in Amazon or anywhere, and it's like $6 because I was not going to make money. This was for teachers to be able to do it. So it's I think the entire title is A Practical Guide to Integrating Technology Task-Based Language Teaching. Yeah. But the principles of how task-based language curriculum works are the same.
Yeah, in terms of sequencing tasks, I know in the interview with Rod Ellis, he's not convinced that our field has figured out how to sequence tasks based on task complexity, but it seems like the openness of tasks can be a strength. You mentioned a task that low-level students can also do, and higher-level students can also do with more complex language. That, to me, I actually like the openness in some way. We cannot control the kind of language that students are going to produce. So do you want to talk a little bit about the task complexity framework? Or
that is huge.
Yeah,
so difficult to really summarize it, but there's two different fields also that look closely at what kind of task and how that affects the way that you can produce language and what kind of language you can produce. But I think for teachers, Robinson has a nice, I think it's his 2011 book that has a really nice list. It's just a list, and actually I reproduce it in this book, in my book that I was talking about. It's just a list that is really useful for teachers. So it just talks about, the number of elements that you have in a task. So you ask students to do one thing, that obviously is less complex than if you ask them to do three things, right? If you ask them to think abstractly about the past or the future, it's more difficult than if you ask them to do something in the present. So you can, again, change that task to make it less complex or more complex. And the number of elements that are there. So, I mean, it's a group of bullet points that I think are quite intuitive, without going into the entire, hypothesis and theory, that can be useful. And especially, like I was saying, to differentiate the tasks that beginners can do and advanced students can do. A lot of people say that TBLT is not for beginners, and I totally disagree with that. In our program, we start from zero, and we start with a TBLT program. So that is actually, I don't think that's true. Is it more, as a teacher, when we see advanced students doing a task, it looks a lot more exciting, and they can do a lot more things. Yes, but that's in every method. Yeah. If you do CLT and you get advanced students doing CLT, oh wow, they can't talk, right? And you got beginners and they're like answering with one word here, one word there, right? But that does not mean that they're not learning if they're engaged in a task. The task may be much more minimal. They may need a lot more input-based task and a lot less free output, right? Because they can't really talk a lot, but that's okay. They're still learning.
Share with us a future plan or anything that you would want teachers and listeners here to know.
That would be a long list, but basically it would be to be open, because change happens. We have to adapt. There's no, I mean, we're humans, and the context and the environment drives us. We need to adapt, right? So right now, in the area of AI, a lot of teachers are just going crazy. It's like, oh, I can't do writing anymore. Well, no, you cannot do the same writing that you were doing before, right? That doesn't mean that, technology is scary, yes, but that does not mean that you cannot use it to your benefit. So I always say, if you believe that students learn through tasks, then focus on the task. What task do students need to learn to do? And actually, if for their future, job in another country, they need to do prompt engineering, well, that's something that you may want to start working now in the second language, right? And do your prompt engineering, look at it, see how good it was, what results you get, critically evaluate, what's happening, is there any bias there, how do we solve that? And that is incredible writing and reading practice, right? So yeah, maybe reading an old text and answer some questions is not the way to go. Well, it wasn't even a good task to start with. Just not really what people do. People read a text for a purpose, not to answer multiple choice questions. That's not what we do, right? You read something so that then you can do something with it. Well, try to think in tasks that students will need to do with AI, with virtual reality. I mean, virtual reality right now, it's so far ahead of many other technologies, right? You can embed students in a real context. Many students still cannot travel to Machu Picchu. Well, why not bring in Machu Picchu to them and actually have a guide, right? Create a guide so that you can teach other tourists how to, visit Machu Picchu. Get the content, research about it, and then go into the VR and create these tours, right? So there's a lot of things that the technology can promote. But again, imagination is key, right? You have to be able to think, okay, I want my students to be able to learn this type of task. It implies this language. Now, can I do it with the technology so that they also learn that technology, like the AI case, right?
Yeah.
I want to teach my students how to do good prompts, because they will need to in their jobs. Yeah. So why not do that in the language learning class?
I think this
prompt
is
engineering in the L2 is new. I haven't heard that one before.
Teach them to do that. So that
why not? Programming. I mean, there's so many things that you can do in an L2 that would be so useful for them, and they have a reason to learn the language and everything else,
heard recently that people that are using like coding agents have actually started translating their inputs into Chinese because it uses fewer tokens, right? Because Chinese is more condensed in terms of like the total number of characters, and that saves you money, I guess, because like the output will come and it's like shorter. But I was like, huh, I guess it's a good way to learn Mandarin, just so you can prompt it to write your code.
So you can
for
look at it the other way, right?
Yeah.
Okay, if that task is better in Mandarin, why not bring it into a Mandarin class, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I think, answers many, I feel, addresses some of the concerns or fears among teachers as well, that we still have so much work to do in terms of creating activities and tasks for students, because we have the imagination and we understand the students. To me, it is exciting to write activities and tasks as well, not just relying or being afraid that AI is going to replace me. And then there are new real life tasks all the time that we need to teach students to do. So I think I love your answer to address some of the teachers' thinking and concerns there as well. Thank you so much again, Marta, for this conversation.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Pleasure to talk to you too.